The problem that Sweden is facing is that they brought in Somali refugees in the 90s who had children who are not overtly religious in any capacity, and the crime that they're witnessing is gang-related violence with grenade attacks. They've collected old weapons from the Balkan Wars, and they're throwing grenades at each other. They're getting fully automatic weapons, and it's completely unrelated to religion. I think what we're seeing now with the current generations and their movement dramatically away from I mean, to be honest, any kind of moral tradition, though I don't think all moral traditions are good. There are some that are in the East that they chop your hands off and things like that I'm not a fan of. But the moral tradition we have in this country about honoring your parents, about not stealing, not killing, is slowly disappearing, and I would say largely built in the Ten Commandments. And what we're getting in its wake is people who fear nothing, care for nothing. We're getting these people are ramming cars into department stores in Chicago. It's happened so many times that they've put up barriers in front of in Mag Mile. My friends who live in Chicago are like, you can't even go there anymore. A 13-year-old kid pulled out a gun, started shooting people in a shopping district. Mm-hmm. How is this happening? Well, you've ripped people from any kind of moral tradition, any kind of social fear or cultural consequence, or for many people, any kind of spiritual consequence.
I find that a lot of the great things from Christianity, we've learned them, and then now you're supposed to so you learn a great piece of information from a seminar somewhere. You take that information, you integrate it into your life, you create books, you create empires with that information in it, and then that information is redistributed. That doesn't mean everyone needs to go to that seminar you went to 30 years ago where you learned this. So people that are obsessed with this book and worshiping some dude is like, bro, good luck trying to get half the world to worship a guy. It's insane. We shouldn't be worshiping each other, first of all. But the ideas need to be reintegrated into society. Some of these really good ones, like I think the Ten Commandments, are fascinating.
Well,
I think they're
on
really
that,
They existed prior to the Bible and outside of the Bible, and countries that were largely Christian, like the Scandinavian countries, were largely Lutheran. They had their own state church that are now below 50% population. As it turns out, like their citizenship rates, their crime rates, all lower in Scandinavia than what we have here, and they've largely depopulated the church.
Sweden would like to have a word with you.
Well, Sweden's importing Muslims, which is part of the problem.
And that goes back to the main problem, though.
But I got to stress, the problem that Sweden is facing is that they brought in Somali refugees in the 90s who had children who are not overtly religious in any capacity, and the crime that they're witnessing is gang-related violence with grenade attacks. They've collected old weapons from the Balkan Wars, and they're throwing grenades at each other. They're getting fully automatic weapons, and it's completely unrelated to religion.
And why did they, though? That we need to ask that question. It's because secularism has led to the abysmally bad birth rates. Secularism in studies like Secularism and Fertility Worldwide notes that secularism is correlating with population stagnation, including population decline. That's why they're importing a lot of people.
I don't think in the 90s, Sweden, I could be wrong, but I don't think the importing of Somali refugees and migrants was specifically related to a low population.
They had declining birth rates for many decades.
The Bible tells you not to have kids. Jesus himself says it's better for you to be a eunuch for the gospel. Paul advocates in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that if you're married, it's better that you remain as though you're not married because the present world is coming to an end. He says, if you're single, stay single. I would rather you be like me, be unmarried to serve the gospel.
Are we talking about whether Christianity is true or the effects of Christianity?
There's not a single teaching in the Bible that says you should have kids.
Are we talking about whether Christianity is true or the effects of Christianity?
What I'm saying is we're rooting this to what the book says. Christianity is rooted in the book. And you're saying, listen, because Christianity is diminishing, that's causing lower birth rates. But that's not actually the case. But there's nothing in Christianity that teaches you to have kids.
I do think that's very selective because you are ignoring be fruitful and multiply. I mean, if we're going to say
a Jewish teaching,
sure,
part of the Christian Bible,
and if you want to,
sure, and so is slavery. But you wouldn't let me use slavery. You would say no, that's not in the New Testament.
But hold on. The point made on slavery was that everybody did it. Christians did it. Christians abolished it. Christians supported it. Christians opposed it. So it's moot.
But the unquestionable God says to do it. That's the problem.
And then Christians eventually said, actually, that actually defies some of the teachings. They get rid of it. I think it's a moot point to claim.
But there's no teaching that says you can't own slaves. Not a single word of the Bible says that owning a slave is a sin.
Again, it's not about whether Christianity is true. It's about the actual effects we see in society. You may
Which
think
was your first point.
Yeah, you may think the Bible will cause X,
let's
Y, and
divorce
Z.
Christianity from the Bible. I'm all for it.
But
the sooner we can do that, the sooner it becomes less toxic religion.
I just want to make this one point before we move on, is that you've selected from the Bible only one thing to support your claim. You didn't have to do that. You could have literally said, I do know that the Bible both says to have kids and not to have kids, but then there's no argument to be made, so it seems like you did that intentionally.
I didn't do it intentionally. In the New Testament, that's the Christian doctrine. The last thing that is said about having families is to not do it.
What does it specifically say?
It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that the present form of the world is coming to an end. In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus advocates for people being eunuchs to the gospel. Let me find it real quick.
And Paul also says just before that, this is my own word, not a word from the Lord.
His disciples said to him, if such is the case, talking about divorce, saying that you can't remarry a woman, if such is the case of a man and a wife, it is better to not marry. Then he said to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 7...
It sounds like you're twisting what that actually
It doesn't say...
No, he says...
It doesn't say to all people everywhere don't have kids.
I never said that's what it says. Jesus says...
But the Bible does say be fruitful and multiply.
Let anyone accept this who can. Accept what? That it's better to be a eunuch for the sake of the gospel.
Anyone who can?
Anyone who can accept it, which is why... in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul himself advocates for people remaining single. If you're single, remain single. And why is that the case? Because the present form of the world is about to end.
1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, to the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single as I am.
It's good. He says this can be a good thing, but he also says, hey, if you're burning with passion, get married. So they never say you should never not be married.
I never said that. I never said that the Bible says you should never get married.
Okay.
If you're burning with passion, if you can't control yourself, it's okay to get married.
Okay.
So Paul and Jesus both advocated for limiting your actual family activities.
Okay, and again, we're not talking about whether Christianity is true. We're talking about the actual effects it's created. So, for example, a longtime sociologist thought that secularism would actually increase democratic values. And recently, social and political scientists like John Compton have been saying, no, actually, we're seeing the opposite. It's actually diminishing support for democratic values. So sometimes we think from armchair sociology, X, Y, and Z is going to cause so-and-so. But no, Christianity does cause sustainable population and birth rates.
Well, let's that's the hard question, I suppose, because instead of discussing whether the Bible is real, like you were saying, if Christianity leaves, we were talking about power vacuums, like if the constitutional republic were to fall, what happens to this country if Christianity, let's say Christianity overnight, within like the span of a few months, people just largely abandoned it and said, we're completely over this. Do you believe that there would be no new moral framework, spiritual-based moral framework, or do you think a different one may move in?
Oh, there certainly would be. So a lot of the young people that are moving away from Christianity are actually moving into like different forms of spiritualism. So it's not like they're leaving Christianity and going to atheism. Like that's something that I did, but that's not something that's actually happening in mass. So young people are actually remaining quite spiritual. And believe it or not, there's a really weird crossover right now between people deconverting from Christianity and actually moving into what we might call like Eastern religions. For example, like Buddhism. And Buddhism actually has a lot of the same core tenets as Christianity. So if you look at the core tenets of Buddhism, they believe in charity. They believe in being kind to your neighbors, So like there's certainly, it's not like we're creating an open vacuum for all hell to break loose. Like people are still going to gravitate towards structure because the human mind desires structure.
So
Islam is projected to be the fastest growing religion in the United States as Christianity declines.
And that's a huge problem.
That is a fucking huge problem.
And why are we seeing that? Because we can see in real time what secularism, the secularization of America and Europe is doing. Declining birth rates, lower levels of charity. In fact, John Compton and Philip Gorski, Roger Brubaker have pointed out, as Christianity has been declining, we're seeing a less value and appreciation for democratic values, more rise of right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. This is coming out of the actual data we're seeing.
Let me just...
How does the data point to less Christianity, more totalitarianism? Because that's not
question.
True in any of the other countries.
Let me just...
If you just look at the other democratic nations that have de-Christianized, we're not seeing that they're going into extremism. So almost
you
all
don't
of the
see authoritarianism in Europe?
Denmark, Norway.
I'm sorry, you need to go to those countries. They call Sweden the North Korea of the North.
So you're picking on Sweden, but
absolutely.
Have you looked at any of the other countries?
I did.
Germany,
because they rate very well on the democratic and the happiness scale every single year.
Complete and utter BS.
So the people collecting that information is all lying to you.
Just like North Korea does, right? The people of North Korea vote for Kim Jong-un 98% every single time. The media in these countries is homogenous and under deep authoritarian control to the point where when I went there to post YouTube videos, we actually had spooks from the government spying on our hotel rooms. That's when we went to one location, and don't get me wrong, I've been to Norway and Bergen as well. It's not identical, but it is very, very similar in how the media is controlled and how people, they call them brainwashed in the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah,
I went to Sweden. And the first thing I did was I interviewed a Green Party leftist politician who seemed very reasonable. They all praised me and cheered for me unanimously across all the media. We went to Rinkeby and we got attacked by the children of Somali migrants. I don't say attacked. They were screaming at us and the police warned us they would start throwing stones and they'd escort us out. I said, okay. When I tweeted that, instantly, the entire media apparatus of the country turned on me. The entire narrative inverted, and they were saying I was a crackpot Alex Jones conspiracy theorist. When I started talking to people outside the country, they said Sweden's, of course, the worst, but the rest of these countries operate under this authoritarian, homogenous culture, much like, and I hate to go Godwin's law, it isn't so much that the government comes to you and beats you to death or throws you in a camp. The homogeneity and the authoritarianism they have is if you speak out, you will have no money, you will have no home, and you will never work again. And so everybody falls in line and no one dares speak about it.
Mm-hmm. Which is weird because the data says that they're happier, they live longer, they're healthier.
Well, I can address that. Absolutely true. There was one of the most famous studies on choice and happiness was they brought people into they pitched a bunch of people. Would you like to do a study? Everybody says yes, right? They get their two groups, their control group and their study group. And they said, the study is to fill out this questionnaire. When you're done, you'll get a free T-shirt. Whenever everybody fills out the questionnaire, what they didn't realize the real study was, as they're leaving, one group was handed a free white T-shirt. They said, thank you. The other group was told, you can have the green, white, or blue T-shirt. Then they got to choose. As they were walking out, they said, please rate your satisfaction with your experience here. Guess what? The people who got to choose the color of shirt they wanted rated higher levels of unhappiness because they were unsure of themselves. That was actually a surprising finding in which they found, as I would say, as Harriet Tubman said, to go back to slavery, I have freed many slaves. I would have freed many more if only they knew they were slaves. Ignorance is bliss. Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon. So subscribe and come hang out.